Hi everyone, my name is Nathan Santorini, and this is my presentation on food culture in ancient Peru, specifically the Inca Empire. Okay, so the Inca Empire was founded in the early 13th century by Manco Capac, who led his people to what is modern-day Cusco, Peru, um, and they settled there and established the empire, the Inca dynasty, um, and at its largest, the empire covered parts of Peru, Chile, Colombia, and Ecuador and Argentina. And it was the largest civilization up until that point in South America. Um, they were a relatively short-lived civilization, however, and they were conquered by the Spanish in 1533. And due to a mix of things, there's a lot we don't know about the Incas still. Uh, a big one being they didn't have a written language, so we can't find written accounts of what has happened firsthand. The only people who were around them who did write things down were the Spanish, who were under orders to destroy their civilization and all of their monuments, religious idols, etc. Um, in fact, one of the only fully intact religious sites or monuments still around is Machu Picchu, which is the hugely famous, essentially religious center, temple city at the top of a mountain, uh, which is quite close to the capital of Cusco. Um, and yeah, the Inca Empire consisted of many Andean tribes of people who were brought together when the empire was formed. You can also see how the empire expanded in the map, starting with the dark red, which was when the empire was founded, and then it grew massively under Pachacuti, as well as the second two emperors grew it a little bit slower. And so this is Machu Picchu, the most well-preserved Inca monument. It was believed to be a retreat for the emperor to come and essentially vacation. It was also a sacred religious site. So the Inca were an agricultural people through and through. They lived in large groups of extended family called Ayu, and in these Ayu, everyone was somehow related. Um, so essentially, the entire family group, the Ayu, would own a large piece of land, which would then be sort of subdivided for newlyweds. So when a couple was married, they were allotted a piece of land, which they would basically subsist off of. And so everyone grew their own food and kind of helped each other out when necessary. Um, and so there was less focus on the nuclear family than we have today in our society, for example. It was more about, everyone around you essentially was family somehow or another. In fact, the Quechua word, which was their language, for uncle and father were the same, as well as for brother and cousin. They didn't make a distinction. Everyone was family and everyone lived together. And religion played a large part in the Inca's everyday life, which we'll come to see. Okay, so because the different indigenous groups had already been established before the Inca Empire actually was formed, they had their own kind of smaller religions, which they were actually allowed to practice, yet they had to also respect the Inca overarching religion. So they kind of did double duty in that way. And they built a complex system of roads throughout their kingdom, which they would use to trade, travel, and go on religious pilgrimages. They were a society without money, and the only type of kind of taxes that were levied were compulsory military service and sometimes compulsory labor, things like building monuments. And they actually built really advanced suspension bridges and were master stoneworkers despite having pretty limited technology. They didn't have metalworking and they didn't have wheels. So Inca agriculture was very advanced for its time. What they would actually do is terrace the mountainsides, which allowed for not only maximization of the actual space available to them, but also for downhill irrigation systems, which would prevent the crops from flooding, as well as deliver enough water during rains to all the crops. And then what they would also do is plant certain crops in the valleys where the soil was more fertile, and then other crops which were a little hardier up on the terrace plots. The Inca often also kept llamas and alpacas as livestock. They would herd them. Uh, they were used for fur, leather, transportation, and occasionally meat. Although the common people mostly would eat guinea pig for meat because they were much easier and cheaper to um, keep and domesticate. But the llamas and alpacas were often sacrificed to the gods in religious rituals, in which they would essentially ask for a good harvest and favor from the gods, for rain and whatnot. So the Inca had a largely varying diet, especially between the different smaller subgroups. But it was mostly vegetarian, especially among the common people. They cultivated tons of different plants. Um, there were like over 200 varieties of potato throughout the empire, and so they ate a lot of potato, and they would make it into stews and soups, as well as maize, quinoa, amaranth, and tons of local fruits, which they would forage for, as well as nuts and berries. Um, and meat was eaten on occasion, um, mostly by those with more wealth, government officials, military officers. And meat was eaten on religious ceremonies as well as during travel. They would eat dried meat, like on religious pilgrimages. So, as mentioned earlier, there was a lot of variety in their diets, especially between different groups, because the climates, up on the mountains versus down in the valley or out by the coast are very different, and so the crops they grew effectively were very different. Um, so the coastal people ate a lot of fish, salmon, herring, octopus, um, you name it, essentially. Um, and the road system, once it was built, allowed for trade of mostly dry goods throughout the kingdom. So as mentioned earlier, there was a lot of variety in the diet between Inca people just due to the microclimates in which each subgroup lived. So those out by the coast would eat tons of shellfish, fish, whatever they could essentially hunt. Um, Whereas those in the mountains subsisted almost entirely off of their agriculture. Um, and once the road system was built, that allowed for tons of trading of dry goods throughout the empire. And sort of continuing with the theme of their technological advances ahead of their time, the Inca actually invented a sort of early form of freeze drying in which they would wait for a cold and dry night and they would leave potatoes or meat out and they would let them mostly freeze and then they would go and squeeze all the water they could out of them. And then during the daytime when it was warmer, they would cover them as to not let them get rehydrated or warmer. And then they would repeat the process every night until the potatoes or meat was essentially, free of moisture and it would keep for a very long time. And the freeze-dried potatoes were called chuño. And then they made charqui, which was the freeze-dried meat, and they would often eat that while traveling. And so these food preservation techniques went a long way to help the kingdom, the empire. They would actually store 3 to 7 years worth of food for the entire standing army. right by the capital city in Cusco. This was actually required by the emperor. Um, and this was super important because if there was a bad year, you didn't get enough rain, um, they could starve. And so they had this, again, really advanced food preservation technique and storage facilities. That's what you see here, the kulkas. And it's essentially grain silos made of stone. So an important part of the Inca religion was their pilgrimages. They would go from wherever they were, namely the capital city Cusco, um, to the highest mountain peaks in the area, and they would make sacrifices to the gods, which included human sacrifices, livestock, food, drink. So an important aspect of the Inca religion was their pilgrimages they would take in order to make sacrifices to the gods at the tops of the mountains, which they considered to be sacred ground. They actually considered the mountains to be the gods themselves, um, and the city of Cusco was situated between four of the largest mountain peaks, which the Inca worshipped. So they would take these long pilgrimages, um, and they would go and make these sacrifices of food, people, drink, etc. And on these pilgrimages, they would eat their preserved meat and grains. The Inca also asked their gods for good fortune with their harvests often. Sacrifices were made at these harvest festivals, a notable one being Inti Raymi, which lasts 9 days and includes lots of sacrifices, dancing, um, and kind of theatrics. And this happens uh, for their new year. The Inca also had harvest festivals when they were about to plant the first crops of the year, as well as when they were about to actually harvest. The emperor would actually plow the ground for the first time of the year with a solid gold plow. Um, they also have a 9-day festival called Inti Raymi, which included sacrifices of sort of the usual suspects: animals, drinks, people, and food. Um, and so this was a 9-day long festival in which everyone would eat together, dance, and sing. So Inca cooking was still pretty primitive. They would essentially make ovens in which they would heat stones and put their food between the stones with a fire underneath to roast things, or they would boil food, making soups or stews in clay pots called pailas. Um, and grains were often crushed in a mortar and pestle and then boiled in water to make a porridge. Quinoa porridge was very popular. The Inca ate 2 meals a day, one in the early morning and then one in the evening. Although this wasn't necessarily a standardized thing, I'm sure each subgroup had their own eating habits, and due to the lack of a written language, it is pretty hard to find information exactly on how many meals they ate per day. So, in summary, the Inca were a rich agricultural society with a diverse diet and advanced food preservation techniques. Due to their lack of a written language, there's a lot we still don't know about them, and the only like concrete information we have from the time is from Spanish first accounts, as well as archaeological findings of the kingdom. But there is a lot more to be discovered, and a lot of their descendants still live today. So thank you so much for watching. Here is my list of sources I used for the presentation, and have a good day. Thank you.